I'm alive. I shouldn't be.
He should not be alive. This is unfucking believable.
From the heart of trucker America, my boy Reed Coverdale, host of The Naturalist Capitalist.
This is what government does. It sucks.
If you think you're going to win people over by stating commonplaces, you're just selling the other part.
It is about dictating every transaction that you have for the rest of your life.
Mr. Potato Head.
Coverdale is the guy to be president of the United States.
You intimidated me with your perfect 74 stat.
That was the beginning of my problems.
A guy doing what he loved, chasing a minor.
Well, I'll put a 50 cal attached to my Suburban.
Libertarians need to get out of New York.
The gulag is going to be in your house.
This guy's a fucking murderer. He deserves to be in a
Gotta get him out of that truck at night and get him into the White House.
What's going on, everybody? Thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Naturalist Capitalist. I'm your host, Reed Coverdale. It's been, I think, a couple weeks since I put an episode out. I was on vacation up in Maine throughout Thanksgiving week, and I just started a new job last week. I know I posted on socials that I'm starting a new job on Monday. I technically started this Monday, but I didn't actually start doing my job until this coming Monday. We have a vacuum truck that we just ordered, and it was getting finished up this week, so I was just doing kind of busy work, but I'm going to start doing that full time on Monday. So I'll be sucking even more than usual. But yeah, there's a lot that's happened in the last couple weeks. Elon Musk has officially taken to Twitter. I can't remember if that had already happened before a couple weeks ago. It's all kind of blending together now. But there's been all sorts of crazy shit going on with that. Trump's back on Twitter now. Kanye West has been making some spicy tweets and also causing all sorts of havoc, on shows that he's been on. So it's been pretty chaotic to witness. It's been a lot of fun and pretty hilarious to watch at the same time. So my friend Jacob Winograd, who is a Christian, but was raised, I think raised in a Jewish family. I know he was bar mitzvahed as a kid and everything. He and I did an episode, I don't know, it might've been 2 months ago now. It was a while ago, where we actually talked about some of the stuff you're not allowed to talk about relating to Jewish people, like what is anti-Semitism, what isn't anti-Semitism, what should be off limits, what should be, open for discussion, just kind of delving into all of it. And I never put the episode out. I was going to listen to it again to see if I really wanted to actually put it on YouTube. This one was pre-recorded, and I never did. So I'm just going to have them on live, and we're just going to hope for the best. We're just going to see what happens. So from the Biblical Anarchy podcast, everyone's favorite three-name, Christian anarchist, Jacob Daniel Winograd, Biblical Anarchy. How are we doing tonight, man?
Doing good, man. Doing good. I need to start actually messing with the names when I'm on StreamYard and stuff. Put something up different each time. Yeah,
you should. It's always I don't even know what your name is anymore. You're like the Trinity, the 3-in-1, Jacob Daniel Winograd, but you're also just one person. Three names but one guy.
So this is the next level. There's people who try to be anonymous on social media, but I just put so much confusion out there as to who I really am that there's really not much you can do.
Yeah, no, that's actually smart, because I think that's how they mostly do it nowadays. I mean, they don't really have to censor as much if they just. That's what we're going to get into here. But they don't have to censor nearly as much, because they can just flood the market with bullshit and no one ever pays attention, But you don't have to specifically necessarily go through and censor everything that you don't want people to find out about. You just flood the market with dumb shit that no one will, so much so that no one will even look for the truth anymore. That's what I
had my first YouTube strike this week, but it was dumb. It wasn't even over anything. There's plenty of stuff I've said that, if it was taken down, I would have been like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But they took down an old video from, a year ago, and they flagged me for misinformation about the 2020 election. Mm-hmm. And all I said was Republicans believe that the election was stolen. It's like that. I don't
Yeah,
even
you
think
can't
that's
really call that misinformation.
Yeah, it's like, well, like the fact that you are going after people for spreading misinformation is proof that there are people out there who believe that.
Right.
Like if it wasn't true, then you wouldn't be going after people. It's like anyway. I appealed it and they denied it. Then I tweeted at YouTube on Twitter and they were like, "Oh, we'll look into it." I was like, "Yeah, whatever."
Yeah. So here's a good question. Let's just get right into it. It says, so he is an ex-Jew relating to you. So I'm not sure how this works. If it's like in the Marine Corps, you know how in the Marine Corps, like you're once a Marine, always a Marine. Like I'm not sure if being Jewish is the same way. So can you explain how this works? Like, are you a Christian Jew? Or are you just a Christian? Or like, can you actually leave the Jewishness behind? Is it something that follows you for the rest of your life? How does this work? Just so people know.
Right. So my dad was raised Jewish and then converted to Christianity, but still identified as a Jew. So I was raised as not like we weren't officially like Messianic Jews, but it's essentially kind of how I was raised. You know, so like we practiced Hanukkah, we practiced the feasts, we practiced Passover. My dad studied Hebrew and stuff and tried to, you know, teach us Jewish traditions and whatnot that he grew up with. But we believed in Jesus as Messiah, and we went to a Christian church. We didn't go to a Messianic synagogue, mainly because I think there was like none around us, so that wasn't really an option. But my dad's always, you know, kind of led with his Jewish identity first. I have a lot of Jewish family, so I was very much raised in sort of, both a Christian but also Jewish culture. So,
gotcha. So, I really don't like the term Jewish or Jew because it's so vague. Like it doesn't.
Like my name, it's the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like I don't know which it is. You know, it's like three things, but which one are we actually talking about at a given time? Yeah, it's like so. I feel like, you know, if someone says I'm a Jew, I don't even know what that means. Like if they just tell me that, it's like, okay, so does that mean, you know, you believe in the Jewish religion? Does that mean you're Israeli? Does that mean that your mother was Jewish? Does that mean that you celebrate Hanukkah? Like, I mean, it's just such a vague thing to say, and it can go in so many different directions. I really don't like using that term at all. I try to stay away from using the term because it's so ambiguous. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, I just tell people that I'm part Jewish because it's the most accurate term, but, you know, it is a little bit ambiguous, and you have the sort of like, so you have people, especially like Jewish people, will kind of, you know, the rule is like if your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish, but if not, then you're not really Jewish. So I don't have a Jewish mother, so technically to a lot of, you know, Orthodox Jews or even just, you know, cultural Jews, I wouldn't be on the same playing field, I guess, as they are, even though I was raised in a lot of the same culture and stuff.
No, never mind.
Yeah.
That's going to come up a lot during this.
I know
episode.
It is. We should get it out of our systems now, though. So, but then you have like, you know, being culturally Jewish, which like even though you know, and also like I think most people like if it doesn't matter whose side of your family it is on, like if your dad was Irish, you would say I'm part Irish, right? So it's like I might not be Jewish according to like the Jewish definition for it, but I'm part Jewish, you know, Jewish. I always tell people like I'm Jewish enough that I'm pretty sure I would have ended up in concentration camps in Nazi Germany. So I think that's passing enough. But you know, but yeah, so you have like the ethnic component, you have a cultural component, then you have a religious component. And, you know, it can be very difficult when you're having conversations with people about just anything related to Jews or Judaism, because you kind of have to define how you're talking about the term in that conversation. And, you know, some people have tried to come up with different terms, like, you know, if you're talking about the Jewish faith, you just call it Judaism. You know, but then it's like, well, how do you, like, a practicer of Judaism is a Jew, you know, and then if you say if someone is, so you have to just kind of, instead of say someone Jewish, you say they are a practicing Jew or something like that, and that's a less clumsy way to phrase it, so to speak. Or you can say someone's ethnically Jewish, or you can say someone's, culturally Jewish. So it's a little bit ambiguous, but I don't think I think that's true for more than just Jews. I think that's true for other ethnicities as well. But I think there's just so much, because of the Holocaust and because of Israel and Zionism, there's an extra level of eyes and scrutiny being put on the conversation itself that makes it more difficult or uncomfortable to have. Also, someone said, this fish in my background is not a coexist fish. This is a Jesus anarchist fish.
It's the same guy that said that was asking the question, I think. So
yeah. Make that clear.
Well, I mean, the only other area I see it even close to the amount of ambiguity is with Muslim. It's a lot of people. Yeah. So liberals, especially, they'll conflate Islam with, being Arabic, and there are two distinct words there. There's Muslim and Arabic. You're from the Arab world doesn't necessarily mean you are Muslim, or you can be Muslim. You don't have to be from the Arab world. It's not quite the same, it's not necessarily the same word, but a lot of liberals try to obfuscate those two things and, make them into kind of the same thing. So if you're criticizing Islam, you are criticizing a culture and a race of people in an area of the world where, no, I mean, if you're going to criticize Islam, you should be allowed to criticize those ideas without necessarily putting all these people groups and everything about them into it just because you don't agree with their religion. But it's like that on steroids with the word Jewish.
Yep. No, I agree. And one of the things we talked about on that unaired podcast is that I think, Douglas Murray talks about how, in our sort of post-World War II society where people are becoming increasingly secular, people haven't come up with a good alternative to Christianity. And there could be one, right? Just for sake of argument, I'm not trying to be too heavy on the Christianity here, we don't have to get into that right now, at least. But we could just posit for sake of argument that there could be secular modes of morality that society could adopt that could fill the gap that Christianity filled if people are going to turn away from that. But even if that hypothetically exists, they haven't, found that yet. And the sort of super morality that has sort of taken foot in Western culture as people move away from Christianity is basically founded on a hyper focus on World War II and especially the Holocaust. And it's everything is filtered through, we can't be Nazis. And the Holocaust was the worst thing that ever happened. Now, to be clear, Nazis were awful and the Holocaust was terrible. And we should be careful to not diminish that, I think. But there are other regimes that happened around the same time that killed more people. And there are other regimes currently right now in real time that are doing very similar things. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be careful. I think the only thing worse than diminishing the Holocaust by, acting like it didn't happen or by, other ways of just trying to overlook it is talking about the Holocaust and trying to pay lip service to the fact that, in the same way as 9/11, never again, we can't let this happen. And you say that, but you continue to support all the modern day versions of the Holocaust right now. I think that's a worse way to diminish the loss of life, all the lives that were killed by the Nazis, is to be historically and, historically ignorant and even ignorant today of all the other regimes doing the same things.
Yeah, I agree with that on a couple levels. One, ignoring the atrocities that are taking place today, but also ignoring how we got to the place that the Holocaust happened in the first place. I feel like We learn a lot of history from 1941 on, or 1939 on, maybe if you pay attention a little bit more. But you never learn about 1918 to 1939, which is very formative in Germany. There's rampant inflation. The Bolsheviks are kind of invading from the east, and partially through immigration, and society's falling apart, and there's all this crazy shit going on. So you have these people who, are not intrinsically evil somehow or something. It's not like they just have this innate hatred toward Jewish people or something. The way that it starts is through, you have this time of desperation, and sane people will start listening to insane people who have solutions, right? Like I'm going to bring Germany back to the way it used to be. We're going to protect your family. You're going to have a solid job again. And so this guy, regardless of anything kind of crazy that he might say, this guy seems the most sane out of everything that's going on. And I mean, to put a more contemporary flavor on it, with radical Islam, like people don't naturally like ISIS or Al Qaeda. Like, they're not attractive to most people in the Middle East. But when you drop a bomb on somebody's neighborhood and you kill their mother-in-law and their wife and their kids and their brother-in-law and, injure half a dozen people or something like that, suddenly makes ISIS and Al Qaeda not seem so crazy anymore. Suddenly they seem like the sane people in the room. So
to further support your point quickly, there are people born here in America who fall under the influence of radical Islam. So if people not to say that there aren't people living in maybe less than ideal circumstances here, a lot of times the people that do fall into that here have some kind of complicated background or trauma, but it just goes to show that if people here can find themselves, radicalized by, the call to Islamic jihad, then even more so the kind of situation you're describing can definitely happen.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of people nowadays, they think this just springs up out of nowhere and everybody just starts hating some other group of people for no reason at all. And I think that's just very naive to think that way about anything.
It's just bigotry.
Yeah, and the other thing is not allowing questioning of something. I think that's just the worst thing you can ever do on so many levels. But if you with the 2020 election, if you're not allowed to ask questions about it, of course people are going to be led to the assumption that it was stolen. I mean, what do you expect them to think? If they're not allowed to question it, that, of course they're going to end up thinking that. Or but another thing, right now, everyone's anti-Semitism sensors are on, set to high right now, and any criticism of Jewish organizations or of Israel or of Zionism or whatever is whoa, 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 you can't talk about that. You can't talk about that. And you have a bunch of people suddenly realizing this and wondering, why can't I talk about this? Why am I not allowed to? And if they're not allowed to talk about it and explore the extremely obvious things that you and I have talked about before on this show and on your show, and, relating to foreign policy goals of Israel and furthering certain organizations that have a protected status or whatever, if you're not allowed to ask about that, then you start to come up with some scary answers to why this is all happening, and you start to listen to some crazy people that you really shouldn't be listening to. And I mean, to me, this is kind of obvious, but a lot of people don't seem to realize that that's how people end up going down that path.
No, I think that's true. I think it's true, for people who fall down the anti-Semitic JQ rabbit hole. I think it's true for people who fall down, even into other forms of alt-right identitarianism. It's people, a similar thing is people fall into the rabbit hole of obsessing over race and IQ. like Stefan Molyneux, an old libertarian voice, kind of fell down that rabbit hole, and some people followed him. And people make that same argument. They're like, "Oh, you're not allowed to talk about race and IQ, so clearly this is something that is true, and there are races that are superior to others based upon IQ." And then rather than scientists or people who are looking into the subject and kind of like just taking on the arguments of like race essentialists head on, people just suppress speech about that, and then the only people going down that rabbit hole end up talking to or are other people who already have those same ideas. And rather than talking to people and kind of going through the studies and kind of explaining how IQ is a imperfect metric, how environmental factors play a huge role in it, kind of just going into like, well, what is race even? And also like, IQ is, there's spatial reasoning, and then there's like mathematics, and there's just different areas of intelligence, and IQ is not a perfect measure of all of those. And there's other, and people use like race and IQ as a explanation for disparity in crime and disparities in economic outcomes, even though people like Thomas Sowell come up with better explanations for those disparities without resort. So it's like you can actually have a conversation with someone and debunk their arguments, and I've actually done that with people who've gone down that rabbit hole and helped them to even sometimes not all at once, but I've helped them to, over time, not go further down that rabbit hole and to not be completely radicalized into like race essentialism and the more radical alt-right extreme ideologies. But in the same way that that doesn't happen a lot in that area, you see the same thing with this whole Jewish thing, is that people start asking questions, and it falls under such heavy scrutiny that people think that there's some, and to some extent like they think there's some major conspiracy, and like there sort of is. I mean, like I obviously don't think it is the extent to which people like Kanye West are going on and talking about, but I do think there are definitely special interest groups out there related to Israel and Zionism that definitely push for criticisms of Israel and Zionism, and even Judaism and things like that, to be suppressed to some extent, because they're kind of this special protected interest group, and that's just not a good way to handle things. I think I'll end on this. I think, and I know Tim Pool, someone that like you're not like the biggest fan of, but I really like the point he made on his podcast after Kanye stormed out on it. He was like, this is just proves wrong everyone who was giving me shit about platforming him. He's like, it's so dumb. He's like, sunlight's the best disinfectant. And Kanye coming on here to talk and then getting butthurt like that and then leaving the minute I provided like, just like, not even like really pushback, just asked him a question, is, the really like the best argument against these people's ideas. And like, I think that, if you really want to push back against anti-Semitism, the first thing you have to do is not be afraid to talk about Judaism and Zionism and all these things, because I think if you just deal with the facts on the ground and don't run away from them, you end up at the truth, which is that there are some people in positions of power who happen to be Jewish, and they certainly have a vested interest in, Zionism and Jewish nationalism and things like that, and they use their power in corrupt ways. But for every one of those, you have a lot of other Jewish people that are just regular, ordinary people going out there living lives and don't really think about these things. Or you have, some of the most amazing thinkers and contributors to libertarianism have been Jewish people like Murray Rothbard or Dave Smith or etc. So it's only, I think sunlight is the best disinfectant, and when you don't have that battle of ideas, it's kind of like in Austrian economics, how like artificial money and spending and stuff like that creates like mal investing and sort of like almost like cancerous growths in the free market. And that's kind of what happens when you suppress free speech, is that you create these artificial problems that if you just allowed the free market to handle them, they'd solve themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the sunlight being the best disinfectant. There are people with way crazier ideas than Kanye West, who like actually think that Jewish people should be deported or killed or whatever. And if you if you ask those people, hey, what do you think we should do to the Jews? And they have to answer in some sort of public forum or somewhere where they're going to be in front of a lot of people and their answer is going to be, up for criticism. It's like, they tend to be like, well, we might, I mean, they won't, they usually won't even say it out loud. They'll usually be like, they'll try to take a couple steps back and like try to cloak what they're trying to say. Or if they are the type, they'll just be bold and say like, yeah, you know what, we need to kill these people or whatever. Like everyone listening will be like, holy shit, this guy is insane. So, I mean, if you're censoring it, all it does is give them a chance to like crawl back into the shadows where they can slowly build a loyal group of followers who are, accustomed to what they're saying already, or they never have to actually answer to those types of questions. They can just talk about the problems they're seeing and, without ever getting into the ugly nitty gritty of what they actually want to do. And therefore they're never like put on display as the absolute maniacs that they are. So yeah, I think I think you're right on when you say that. Like if someone is really a legit neo-Nazi, the best thing you can do is just let them talk. You don't even necessarily need to ask them questions or like, push back. It's more just, hey, please explain your entire philosophy and how you actually want to do this. And it's probably not going to go very well for them.
Yeah, exactly. Just like there's a lot of like some of the radical anti-Semitism you see is like people who take things out of the Talmud or the Jewish religion and like take them out of context and spin them and try to say like, oh, Jews are pedophiles and it's right in their religion and it says it right there. And if you just clutch your pearls at that and go like, Greta Thunberg, how dare you, and don't respond to it, people just go like they keep that meme in their head and then they keep repeating it to their friends. Whereas like it's another thing I've done with people who have made those claims is like, all right, like let's go and read the entire Talmud. Now I'm not Jewish religiously, so there's things in the Talmud I don't agree with, but like you read through it and then you see how a lot of claims that are being put out there are taken out of context. So or just like completely misinterpret, like mistranslated or made up. So there are things in Jewish religion that I think are legitimate to criticize. I think we can criticize Jewish religion. I think we can criticize the Muslim religion. I think you can, you have criticized Christian religion while I've been on your show, and I don't lose my freaking mind about it. So, it's not that I'm saying we can't criticize things, but we should try to criticize accurate portrayals and steelman the opposing side's arguments before we try to take them down. It doesn't really do anyone good to deal in falsehoods. But you can't ever get to the point of debunking the falsehoods unless you have the conversation. And when you don't have the conversation, just like you said, all people end up doing is falling into these, borderline or actual cults where, it kind of like create, like people look at someone like Nick Fuentes, who I think has like nothing really interesting to say, but they go, man, he's like the most canceled person in America because he's telling so much truth. You know what I mean? Like people think that no one wants to debate him or platform him because he's just saying so many true things. And it's like, well, no, not really. People are deplatforming because they are offended by him, and that doesn't mean any of his ideas are right, but no one gets to see, other than like, I think the only meaningful debate I've ever seen Nick have is with Dave, and I think Dave went easy on him, to be honest. I think Dave could have gone a lot harder on that debate, but I think Dave's always trying to be the nice guy when he's dealing with, anyone but Figuritarians type people. But yeah, I think for the most part, it's like if you get opportunities to let these people talk, let them and rebut their ideas. Don't just respond with being offended.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a couple of different angles here. So from the libertarian perspective, the criticism is of the state of Israel and Zionism. But from a personal perspective, I also have criticisms of the religion of Judaism. And then I think it's also completely fair to criticize Jewish culture, just like it's completely fair to criticize American culture or, Christian culture or secular culture, like whatever label you want to put it. I don't think any of these things should be off limits to talk about. Like, I mean, it's just kind of weird to me that this is one that's so taboo. And I think you're right that a lot of it stems from the Holocaust and from Israel and Zionism. It's just like this, this really unique situation that we're in with this particular subject. But a lot of people, they'll always like say, look, I'm not talking about the religion. And I'll be like, well, I don't know. I kind of am. Like I am critical of Judaism, not just Zionism, but, I think that Zionism is in large part excused by Judaism and then also by Christianity in a large part. Like I feel like I tend to feel like the people in power don't actually believe the religions. Maybe that's not true, but I feel like, Netanyahu, I kind of doubt that he's really a convicted religious man. Maybe he is, I don't know, but I feel like people at that level, they're just using it as a they're just using it as mind control basically to get what they want. Like maybe that's not true, but that's just too far out there to really know if it's true. But for sure, whether or not the people in charge of these governments and these institutions, if they actually believe any of this stuff, a lot of the people who support it do believe in this stuff. They do believe in Armageddon. They do believe that the end of the world's coming and that Jerusalem has to be the capital of Israel, whatever. So I think it's completely fair game to criticize the religions because I think that's where a lot of this stems from. And you can criticize the political aspect of it all day, the statist aspect of it. But at the end of the day, for me as an individual, I'm going to be like, yeah, well, there's a reason a lot of people support this. And it's because they believe this superstition. But I wanted you to address Zionism, like why as a Christian you're not Zionist. Like I know we've talked about this before on the show, but what is the new Israel? What does Jesus say differently than the Jewish religion? Like what sets Christianity in the way you see it apart from Zionist religions? Right.
So I think to answer your question, I'll start by actually going after Judaism a bit because then it leads into the Christian answer. I think Judaism does actually provide cover for Zionism, and that's a legit critique of the Jewish religion you can make because I think, as a Christian, I think Jews are kind of like missing half the truth. And so the Jews think they're still waiting for the Messiah, and they still think that, the sort of like old covenant that God promised Israel all this land and that they're supposed to be this great nation chosen by God. I think that plays a little bit into, but not a little bit, I think it plays a lot into Zionism and a lot of like the powers that be doing all this cover and advocating for all this, money and special interests and attention to go to Israel and this protection to go towards Israel. And so, fundamentally, because I think the Jewish people rejected Jesus, their religion is, although it has the same foundation as Christianity, it's kind of gone off the rails, so to speak, because of that. So to get into the Christian answer, when Jesus comes, he is rejected as Messiah by the Jews because they were looking for a political savior. But Jesus said that my kingdom is not of this world, and that the kingdom that he has come to set in place is a spiritual one, which is echoed by the apostles later when they say, you know, we don't struggle against flesh and blood, but against, you know, principalities and the forces of darkness and etc. So, you know, a lot of the New Testament after the, you know, Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is written by Paul, and Paul was a Jew who converted to Christianity, and so he spent a lot of time writing to Jews in the various books and kind of explaining to them, like, listen, like, you know, we have to stop looking at ourselves as this special chosen people. Jesus came to die for all, and he came to extend the promise that originally was to Abraham and the Jews, but now it's to everyone. It's to Jew and Gentile alike. In 1 Corinthians, you get the passage where Paul says that in Christ Jesus there is no Jew nor Greek, there is no male nor female, there is no slave or master. You know, we are all one in Christ. And you kind of eliminate this idea of, I mean, there's still like an elect and a chosen, but the chosen are just all of those who are saved by faith in Christ and who have that grace put upon them. You know, and there's also a strong push to reject works-based salvation, which Judaism is still sort of caught up in, and rather that salvation comes through saving faith that comes through revelation by the Holy Spirit. Where we get into, you brought up, like, you know, who is the new Israel, and this gets a lot into eschatology and gets into, you know, you have to really like study the book of Revelations, and we don't have 2 hours here to do a complete rundown of the book of Revelations, but it's a very complicated book. You know, I think the book is much more an allegory about Nero and Rome than it is a book about the end times and whatnot, but just sort of like, you know, I think most books in the Bible are kind of like dual purpose. They have a contemporary message, but also like a message that applies to us today and applies in an eternal sense. So, you know, the only thing that, you know, I think all Christians of different eschatological belief systems agree is that, you know, Jesus is going to return. There's going to be like a new heaven and a new earth. But what sort of became popular in the evangelical wing of Christianity was this idea of dispensationalism, which was kind of like a pre-millennial view of eschatology, and yeah, basically thinking that, like, you know, Israel's got to be restored, and that Israel plays an important part in the end times and in the second coming and all that, which completely just overlooks the fact that many times in the New Testament, when it talks about, you know, the new Israel, what it's talking about is the church, because again, it goes back to that promise, and the new Israel is the new nation, the new chosen elect by God that are supposed to go out there and be salt and light and be a blessing to the world and to preach the good news. That's the church. They are the inheritors of that, you know, original promise from that God gave to Abraham back in Genesis. So, yeah, I mean, I threw a lot out there. You know, on my podcast, I've gone into this a few times, so I could provide some links if people want to know more of the nitty-gritty, nerdy breakdown of, you know, like I take more of an amillennialist view when it comes to eschatology. There's premillennialism, post-millennialism, and amillennialism, but just that's kind of like, you know, getting really deep into the details. I think the most important aspect to really hone in on is that the Jews rejected Jesus because he wasn't a political savior, and Christianity rejects Zionism because it's going back into the idea of, like, Israel being the chosen nation and ignoring the fact that, no, there is no more chosen nation. Jesus died for all people, and there is no Jew nor Greek. We are all one in Christ Jesus, and the elect isn't a ethnic group. We aren't called to restore, you know, something that was part of the old covenant. You know, the veil has been torn. We don't need the old Jewish covenantal law. That was for the Jews when they were separated from God before the Messiah came. Now that the Messiah has come, We no longer need the temple. We no longer need the tabernacle and that separation from God. He now dwells in us. So that's the Christian answer for why I reject Zionism and the New Israel is the church.
Yeah, well, so obviously I don't believe any of that, but I am glad that you approach it in that way, and I wish more American Christians did, because I'm not sure of the percentages, but the number of Christian Zionists in the United States definitely is higher than the number of Jewish Zionists in the United States. And Christian Zionists have been more instrumental in voting for neocons throughout the 21st century. I mean, lots of American Jews tend to be more liberal. So lots of American Jews were actually against the Iraq war, even though it was in large part, an Israeli operation, basically. I mean, a lot of it was to secure the realm for Israel, but a lot of American Jews were against that war because the liberals tended to be against George Bush and his invasion of Iraq. But man, a whole lot of Christian Zionists absolutely got on board with that and pushed for it hardcore and 100% voted for it. So, I mean, the Christian Zionist voting bloc is more responsible for a lot of these policies than, American Jews are. So, I mean, and a lot of anti-Semites will actually overlook that fact. They won't even talk about that, Christian Zionism is actually more of a force in America's voting bloc than Jewish Zionism is.
Oh, no, 100%. Zionism is still a very prominent part of the evangelical Christian movement, especially in America. And I mean, I think it might not be as prevalent as it was when I was a kid, only because other issues have kind of started to take a forefront. But I remember back, in the, 2000 to 2008, 2012, I mean, criticizing Israel in church was, blasphemy.
Mm-hmm.
And again, a lot of it was that, dispensationalist mindset. People were big into like the Left Behind movies and rapture theology and things like that. And I think people have started to move away from that on a theological level to some extent, but they haven't really given up their Zionism. That's just a lot of neocon brainwashing, the idea that, Israel's our greatest ally, and if we didn't have Israel over there, the Middle East would just be a completely Christian-hating, American-hating region, and they hate us for my freedoms, and, so we got to fight them over there, so we don't have to fight, people, I think people are, and I to back up a second here, I see a lot of people on the right who are libertarians or libertarian adjacent overstating how the right is anti-war. I think the right has become red-pilled on like this like nation building and going over there and trying to turn these places into democratic institutions and
unless
things
it's
like
Iran.
That. Right, yeah, and I think for the most part they're kind of like kind of getting a little bit like, yeah, maybe we should stop going over there and arming these terrorist groups that come in and take over when we leave, and they're just better armed, and I'll give them credit for that. But I still think there's a lot of people who buy into just the mentality like, oh, these are all, Christian hating, American hating, freedom hating, evil people that, maybe we shouldn't occupy them and maybe we shouldn't bomb them out of existence. But I still think they fundamentally are operating sometimes out of just all the propaganda that's been thrown their way about the Middle East. They're very ignorant still of the entire history. They don't know things about like, our constant interference in Iran and overthrowing their government. And they don't understand the complexities of how disastrous the Iraq war was. They don't understand our relationship with the Saudis. So there's a lot that they still really don't understand. And I think we need to be careful to not let, to not overestimate the knowledge or anti-war sentiment on the right. I mean, it's better than it was during the 2004 George Bush years, but they're still not they're not us. They're not anti-war libertarians.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. So let's get into who is they. I actually think this is an interesting subject, and I think that I do think that there is a group of Zionists who have a lot of power, both politically and socially, in the media. Like I think that the media is very Zionist. I think that the news is very Zionist. I think basically every institution in the United States is very Zionist. Like it's a very American thing to be Zionist, and I think that obviously in foreign policy on both sides of the aisle, everything is dominated by Zionism. I mean, there's only a couple dissenters on each side. Whenever they do dissent, they get called evil anti-Semites or whatever. So it's obviously a culturally dominant thing in the United States. And I think that, the vast majority of it is very, very negative and serves a very specific goal. Now, I don't think most people realize how deep this goes. And I also don't think that they realize what the agenda is here. And I think that a lot of Christians and a lot of Jews just naturally support this because they think it's the right thing to do, because it's in their religion to an extent, and then it's also just baked into the culture. The World War II complex we were talking about, obviously that's still very prevalent throughout America. We defeated the Nazis, we saved the Jews essentially, and we gave them a country. That's just the way people look at it. So I don't think this is the fact that so many people support this. That part I don't think is a conspiracy. That just seems kind of natural to me, that is the way things would go, just because of the propaganda and just because of people's understanding of history and because of the religious aspect. That just all makes sense to me. And then, people who are not religious, like atheist Jews, it makes sense to me that they would naturally, align with Zionist principles, even if they don't believe in the religion, because it seems to protect Jewish interests. And you would see that with any group of people, Christians or Muslims. And then if you're not religious, you'd see it with different ethnic groups, different cultures. They just tend to stick together and watch out for their own. It's not like this is some weird phenomenon. The only thing that is different about it is if you go after any of it, you just get unpersoned and your life is destroyed and your finances are taken away from you. So to me, that's the part that's really the only part about this that is weird. The rest of it just seems kind of yeah, I mean, why wouldn't it be that way? Is that kind of how you look at it, or what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think I mostly agree with that. I think that there are, like I mentioned before, the strains of post World War II, the Holocaust was the worst thing that ever happened, and I think there's the evangelical support for it. I think there's this weird, it's this guilt thing where it's well, and again, it's one of those things. It's not untrue, right? The Jewish people were largely sort of discriminated against and sort of hated in a lot of the areas they were, and no one really wanted them. And in a way, Israel was sort of created, and the Jews were funneled there by Britain and stuff during and after the war, because it was nobody wanted them. I mean, America was turning Jews away and stuff. So my family, when my Jewish family came here, they got here illegally. they didn't go through the check-ins and stuff. So hashtag build the wall. So yeah, I think that there's sort of this guilt thing going on where people think, well, we owe the Jewish people this because of how terrible history has been to them. Now, my response to that, I mean, it's complicated, right? Like, I don't think it's fundamentally immoral if an ethnic group of people wants to gather together and live together.
Right.
So, like, go ahead and do that. The issue is, well, it's layered, right? Like, you can't you can't demand that people pay money to you to go create that ethnic society that you want to live in. You can't also go take land that other people are living on for yourself and do that to create your little ethnic paradise. And I also think it's just insane double standards that it's okay to spend millions of dollars, millions, I'm really underestimating it there, billions of dollars in aid to this ethnic nation, while at the same time demonizing any other, not any other, I guess there's other groups of people that are that I guess there's some maybe like sympathy to if they want to form ethnic communities or whatnot, or segregation. But for the most part, it's like any other ethnic group, if they talk about wanting to have their own nation, it's at least frowned upon. If it's white people wanting to do it, you're just automatically a Nazi. But when Jewish people will do it, it's like, well, this is not only good, but this is the most important thing in the world, and it has to be in where the Jews make their claim to ancient Israel, and it has to be with the backing of the Western powers and primarily America, with billions of dollars sent there to make it happen. And the history there, smarter people than me and you have gone through the history of that. It certainly is convoluted, and I won't generalize there. I think, there are steps along the way where if I'm trying to be charitable, it's one of those things. It's like, it kind of matters where you start the story, right? Because you can kind of frame the story and make it look good for one side if you started at a particular point but don't look any further back. If you look back far enough, I think even a charitable taking interpretation of it is that, like, well, Britain and America and the Western powers definitely, like, put a bunch of explosives in and let the fuse. And I think I'm sympathetic to the fact that there was probably a lot of peaceful Jews that found their way there and were just like trying to find a peaceful place to live, and maybe they were kind of getting fed up of just like constantly moving around and being pushed from one place to another, and felt like they needed to make some kind of stand to just be like, hey, we have a right to exist and not be like treated like cattle and killed. But unfortunately, I mean, we can get, the history is what it is. What ended up happening is the creation of Israel, and what Zionism ultimately ended up doing is they became the aggressors. And I think that has continued into today. And again, like I said at the beginning, yeah, I mean, the Holocaust happened. Debating that it didn't is stupid. Debating over the exact number is also stupid from both sides. It's stupid when people try to focus on, well, it wasn't 6 million, it was less. It's stupid if people get really offended if there are estimates out there that happen to be a little bit less. It's like, whatever, like, if it was 3 million or 30 million, it was still fucking horrible. There's definitely evidence of the piles of bodies and stuff. And, it definitely, near the end of the war, Hitler escalated the killings. It wasn't that bad the whole time, but it was definitely bad. And it's not wrong to contemplate that and to be moved emotionally by the evil that humans are capable of unleashing against one another. But worse than forgetting that or discounting that is to use that as a justification to do that to a whole other group of people. And that's basically what's happening in Palestine right now. I mean, to the Palestinians. And people can try to wiggle their way around it and say it's not the same scale. It's not being done on the discrimination of religion or race or etc. It's like I don't think that's what fundamentally matters. Your motivations for land locking in a group of people and letting them forcing them to live in horrific living conditions and bombing them in innocent civilians. And I hate the freaking excuse like, oh well, the terrorists set that up. They launch missiles from on top of these schools, and so Israel has to level the school. It's like, the fuck kind of lot? Like what? Like, no, you don't. I mean, and it's one of those things where, listen, we don't want to live in Ancapistan in our head, right? Like, Israel's a nation now. Every nation that exists now has a murky history. And I'm not going to sit here and be like, well, Israel has to cease to exist, because that's just not, like, politically realistic right now. I think insofar as nation states are the current paradigm we live in, Israel has more or less the same right to exist as any other nation state, because the history of most nation states is soaked in blood. So, whatever. Let's say, just for sake of argument, even if you disagree with me, Israel has a right to exist. I'll go as far as to say Israel has a right to defend themselves if people are trying to attack them. But no nation, whether it's America, whether it's Russia, whether it's Israel, has a right to, in their acts of defending themselves, justify the killings of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. You can find ways to defend yourselves and keep your people safe without justifying the mass murder of innocent people on the other side. And on top of that, if Israel really cared about their safety, they would be trying to find ways to negotiate for peace and find ways to give the Palestinian people like full access to citizenship and rights within those borders, or at least allowing them some sort of path to get out of the fucked up situation that they're in right now. In the same way that, like, I don't really justify Russia, bombing and killing innocent Ukrainian civilians. But we also can't act like Ukraine and the Western powers influencing and controlling Ukraine have exhausted all sorts of peaceful means to try to de-escalate the conflicts there. We definitely need to hold world leaders and nations to higher standards, and and that definitely applies very strongly to Israel.
Yeah, so I made a post on Twitter the other day that said, a lot of conservatives say anti-white racism is like the most like systemic racism we have now, or it's like the most accepted form of racism. I don't think that's true. I think that is probably number 2, but number 1 is definitely, Zionism, like racism against the Palestinians is definitely the most accepted form of racism throughout America. It's completely normalized and it's institutionalized, and it's kind of the closest thing to white supremacy that exists in the Middle East, because not all Israelis are white, but a lot of them are. A lot of them are white Jews from Europe and America who are just ethnically cleansing their brown Muslim Arabic neighbors, and so it's like, I don't know, that it seems like it should be sort of a liberal cause, but it barely is, like it is with some people on the left. But it's I don't know, it's pretty, it's not like this is even disguised, it's not even disguised well. It's just so hammered into us through propaganda that it's okay that nobody cares about it.
Yeah, and to be clear, like, I think some of what happens is that people they're not libertarians and they have a very unlibertarian view of war, and some people just sort of are callous to, oh, well, while there's war, innocent people are going to get caught up in the crossfire. I mean, so for one, it's like, just on a general level, we need to push back against that, because that is just like Stockholm syndrome, brainwashed statist bullshit. Like, no, we need to, no matter what conflict it is, no matter what side it is, no matter what other geopolitical, factors we need to also be pointing out and calling to light, we need to first and foremost lead with the, like, it's just absolute bullshit in all instances to initiate violence against peaceful people, full stop. Doesn't matter whether they're walking down the street and all they have is some weed in their pocket. Doesn't matter if it's a gay couple who just wants to, get married and live together. Doesn't matter if it's you're at, there's a foreign nation who is, invaded your borders. Go ahead and defend yourself and try to bring an end to the conflict. But you can't justify killing innocent civilians in the crossfire. You just can't. And you can't justify it by blaming the evil. It's like, oh, well, they're willing to stoop to this evil, so we have to stoop to an even worse evil back. I mean, the only thing good I can say about Israel is that they're holding back to some extent, because if they really wanted to, they could really just wipe them all out. And in some ways, I don't know, if you look at some of the living conditions of the Palestinians, it almost would be more humanitarian if they just wiped them all out, because what's going on there it's just as bad as what's going on in Yemen. It's just as bad as what's going on, starting to go on in, places. I mean, in Ukraine, anywhere where war happens, one thing you can be sure of is that the people in power benefit, and that the civilians getting crushed underneath are suffering. I think there's if we want to talk about white privilege, you kind of mentioned this too. If we want to talk about white privilege is white liberals clutching their pearls over, like, New Hampshire making some dumb tweets that even I thought were maybe not that great, while not giving a flying fuck about, kids starving to death in Yemen because of our foreign policy, or Palestinians crying over the charred corpses of their parents because of, John McCain style foreign policy. It's like, you know what, like, we gotta have some perspective. And, as a Christian, I'm especially, motivated by Jesus' call to, what you've done to the least of these, you've done unto me. But fuck, like, you don't need to be a Christian to look at these pictures of all the devastation that our military causes, and that the Israeli military causes, with the backing of our financial aid and our military, to just look at that and go, like, nah, man, like, that, if we're gonna oppose what happened in the Holocaust and oppose it in a meaningful way, we gotta oppose this now. We gotta hold Israel to a higher standard, to be like, no, you gotta work out peace. You gotta treat these people as if they were your own, or let them leave, or something. But you can't keep going on in the status quo like it is right now, because you're initiating the next Holocaust on the graves of the last one, and that's just fucking bullshit.
So last thing I wanted to talk about, I think we're gonna have a little bit of disagreement here from discussions we had offline, but excuse me. I think excuse me. I think the entire, like, intellectual dark web was basically just a Zionist trap from all angles. So you have, like, Sam Harris, who's an atheist, and then you have Dave Rubin, who's like a classical liberal, progressive turned, like, more libertarian dude who eventually became more conservative. And then you have Jordan Peterson, and then you even have, like, Michael Malice, who kind of dabbled in those circles a little bit. Basically everybody who was in that movement was a Zionist from, like, every angle imaginable. And I mean, like Sam Harris would always criticize Muslims for just being like the most disgusting animals on the face of the earth, and just like, having the worst belief system that would drive people to do crazy stuff. But he would never talk about the Israelis and how they treat the Palestinians. Never. He'd sometimes talk about Christianity, but he would never talk about Judaism. You got the same thing from Michael Malice. You have the same thing from from Dave Rubin, and then you have definitely the same thing from Jordan Peterson. And I made a tweet earlier today. I probably could have worded it better, but it was, basically people have blamed Sam Harris's downfall from grace on his lack of religion, where Jordan Peterson, I know he's like given some weird answers about whether or not he actually believes in God in the past, although I think he does now. Like some of his more recent statements, he's basically a Christian at this point. He has said like a lot of dumb shit about censorship and about Israel lately, and a lot of people have just been kind of blindsided by it. And I almost feel like I'm seeing the same thing that happened to Sam Harris a few years ago happening like 3 years in lag, behind him, happening to Jordan Peterson. And I just don't like really have any respect for any of that movement anymore, because that's something that I had really been sucked into like in 2016, 2017. That was where like all my podcasting that I was listening to was coming out of that hub. And when I had James Lindsay on my show, we actually talked about this, how like the new atheist movement was just like a trap. It was just a trap to get people thinking in really collectivist terms about everything. And I kind of feel like that whole thing just ended up, being a trap for everybody. But you have a more favorable opinion of Jordan Peterson. So what do you think? Where do you disagree with me?
Yeah, so Jordan Peterson obviously isn't a libertarian, and
sure,
we can start off with agreement there. And Jordan Peterson definitely, is way closer to a mainstream take on Zionism and Israel and foreign policy than closer to that than a libertarian. Although he's been on some libertarian podcasts and been exposed to libertarian ideas, and I don't think he's there yet, but he's definitely interacted with people and not been closed off to those ideas. So I think one thing I need to start out with Jordan Peterson in sort of defending him.
Oh wait, by the way, I just gotta throw in the other guy is Ben Shapiro. Obviously, like that was the other guy I meant to mention, but obviously kind of the same angle. So keep going though. Sorry about that.
Throw in terms of what do you?
Oh, he was just like another one of those figures who.
Oh, okay,
in
in the IDW,
space. Yeah.
No. So Jordan Peterson, if you listen to his work, one of his biggest concerns is the danger of ideological possession, and because he thinks once you become an ideologue, you're no longer thinking and coming up with your own ideas. You're just echoing the ideas of your ideology. And I think that's 100% true. And I think to whatever extent he's had an aversion to libertarianism is because a lot of the libertarians he's encountered have been way more of like the, super autistic, ideological libertarians who just kind of like, for them it is their religion and they push it that way. And so Jordan's like, more like, well, okay, I kind of see what you're saying, but politics isn't like my specialty and economics isn't my specialty. I'd want to study it more. I'd want to see someone who has a different economic or political bend to you here to provide meaningful pushback towards you, and etc. So, Peterson has definitely, I know it's funny I'm saying this because like, I know it's not like, it's not a clenching defense because it applies to people like Blake Masters too, but Peterson has read like some Austrian stuff. I mean, he's read, Human Action. He's read Choice. He had Bob Murphy on his show, so he's not completely adverse to all this. So there's yeah, he's definitely not a libertarian, but at the same point, I think there is overlap, and I think a lot of his pushback comes more from just the fear of ideological possession, and that his focus is much more on like psychology and culture, and politics ties into that, but I think his work intersects with libertarian ideas a lot, but it's not overt. And so because he's not like really speaking our exact language, I think people don't see that. When it comes to Zionism and whatnot, I mean, obviously he had that interview or the conversation, he sat down with like Ben Shapiro and
Netanyahu,
Netanyahu, and he's also had that recent take about people on Twitter, just like being depersoned if they're not paying the $8 a month. So I can actually defend that one more than I can defend his Zionism. I think his Zionism is partly a product of who he surrounded himself with. He's surrounded by, Ben Shapiro and Daily Wire people and stuff. And, his new thing, like his new series on Exodus, he's got like, what's his name? Dennis Prager on there with him and stuff. So, I mean, he's surrounded by a bunch of hardcore Zionists. So it's not surprising. I will say, Jordan does have a somewhat libertarian view on war. If you ever have the time, go watch his response to like the Russian-Ukraine conflict and the videos he's put out there. Like he's been hardcore.
I've seen some of them. Yeah,
he's been hardcore. Like what the fuck are we doing? Like pushing for World War III. Like the first response we should have had from the get-go, if our leaders led worth a damn, was finding any possible way we could to end military conflict, to find peace, to give and he's even said like we need to like give concessions to Russia. And when he's gotten pushback from his like IEW neocon people, he's like, well, what's the alternative, right? Like we either have World War III or what, we're going to go to war against Russia and they're going to lose and they're just going to go home and they're going to just accept it. You know what I mean? He's like, or we're going to go put our troops on the ground there. He's like, you're not being realistic. So I think with Peterson, it's probably much more just a like general repeating what's around him, and just I don't think he's really looked into that area with a lot of detail yet. So I don't know. I think with all those things said, I think with his overlap into some libertarian ideas and exposure to them, and I think with the fact that I know that he typically is, at least for someone in his camp, someone who tends to be a lot more questionable of war and a very, critical of the dangers of like, like he's studied intensely, like Soviet era, like art and literature and stuff from like and like all of the atrocities that have happened. So he's very much aware of what can go wrong with war. So I don't know. I think to equate his sort of like tacit support of Zionism just from his associations and to say like, well, he's the same sort of Zionist that like Ben Shapiro is or others are, I don't think that's quite fair. And
I think that is. I don't think he's a tacit supporter of it. Like he was calling Thomas Massey, I can't remember if he called him an anti-Semite. I think he might have, for not supporting Iron Dome funding. Like he attacked him like Ben Shapiro attacking Ron Paul back in 2008. And
I didn't see that. So
he's like,
I might have missed
did you see the video of him crying on stage talking about how Israel's the city on a hill? And like, I mean, it goes pretty deep. Like it's not just tacit support based on his associations.
He's speaking a lot more of like from his biblical studies and the sort of like, archetypical role that Jerusalem and Israel plays in the Old Testament narratives and stuff. And yeah, I mean, I think he's making an error, obviously, but I don't think. I don't know. It's also fair to say that I think that Peterson's also a mixed bag since he came back from his recovery from his benzos and stuff, and I think he's definitely gotten caught up in the culture war a little bit, and he's gotten a bit more angry. He's not immune to ideological possession, so I think he tries to avoid it, but I think he might not be aware to some extent how much he's falling into it with his new crowd. But I think he's, behaving his incentives a little bit more, in my opinion, than he is a diehard, bleeding heart Zionist. But that's just my impression. And I think also it's like, even if I was going to grant that he is a really bad Zionist, it's like, again, that's not really the focus of his work. I don't view him like, he's not going out there like someone like Ben Shapiro and like literally on a daily basis shilling for Israel. Like, Jordan Peterson might have said some things here and there, but that's not.
I don't know.
That's not his. I listened to Jordan Peterson, pretty regularly, and that's not like the focus of his everyday content in the way that like other people's content tends to veer towards that a lot. Peterson's a lot more focused on, approaching things from a psychological angle, pushing back against things on the left right now. There's a lot of other issues besides Zionism that he's got a very libertarian or libertarian adjacent position on. I think that comparing him to Sam Harris is just like
from 3 years ago.
I don't even think Sam Harris was that good 3 years ago. I mean, he was good on.
Well,
free
I don't
speech.
either, but I'm just saying.
Like I would say, like Sam Harris was good on free speech, and not even that good on free speech. He was just like, he got canceled for criticizing Islam, so he was just less, bad on free speech than your typical leftist atheist was at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I don't think. I mean, one thing I want to be careful of is that, like, I don't think that someone has to be a perfect libertarian for us to learn from them and for us to think that they're a positive force in society. I
don't either.
If I saw Peterson literally every day, like, what motivates him is Zionism, he's out there playing cover for the atrocities that Israel's done, and literally just like feeding everyone the same line of propaganda and BS that, like, again, someone like a Ben Shapiro does. Ben Shapiro is someone I have a harder time. Like, I used to like Ben Shapiro a little bit back when I was an early, like, moderate becoming libertarian type, and I wasn't as quite into foreign, like the stuff in because even though I was always anti-war, I never looked into the Israel stuff much until I became a libertarian, and I just kind of still held on to like my upbringing in sort of like just the pro-Israel rhetoric, and it wasn't until I encountered like Scott Horton and people like that.
Well, what I was going to say is I actually know people who came to libertarianism because of Ben Shapiro, and like he was someone I listened to for a little while, on my journey. So I don't think, I'm certainly not saying we should cancel anybody or like disregard everything that anybody says. I've never felt that way about anybody. I just think like we have a problem, and I don't mean just libertarians. I mean, people in general have a problem with just creating heroes where there isn't one, basically, or creating idols, I guess, if for a good term, for a good religious term, like, so, I mean, I felt like libertarians did that with Blake Masters. Like, I feel like now that everything's over, people should be willing to admit, like, okay, like, yeah, he was a little bit better on several issues, but he really wasn't all that we were trying to make him out to be. Like, I have had to go through that with Tulsi. Like, I realized Tulsi isn't really that great. Like, she's good on a few things, but, and I've felt this way for a while about her now, but it was a thing I had to go through where I was like, yeah, she really did suck on a lot of this stuff that I was trying to overlook because I just really wanted somebody who was like, the next thing that we wanted.
Yeah,
I feel like people do that with Jordan Peterson, and I sort of did it with Sam Harris for a while. Like, it's been years now, but a while back, like, I really defended him a lot, and then eventually it was like, okay, this is so stupid, I can't defend this anymore. And like but I don't think like Sam Harris never says anything that makes any sense. Like sometimes he does. I mean, he's gotten really, really bad lately, but I'm certainly never saying we should like. I mean,
don't know what
Kissinger is saying sane stuff about the war in Ukraine now, so like it's not like you can ever like fully discount anything anyone says.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just don't see, and it could be just my bias as a Christian. I just don't see what Sam Harris contributed. Even like if I was going to like put an atheist perspective on it, like I don't think Sam Harris ever made atheist arguments that were unique. I think there are other atheists who are more impressive than Sam Harris, and I don't think Sam Harris really did anything that original, other than like criticize like the thing, like the two things, like the only one thing that Sam Harris was ever good on was not being unwilling to criticize Islam, and then being tacitly a bit better on free speech because he got canceled for it. But that's basically it, and I think he's betrayed a lot of that over the last few years, and I don't think his betrayal of his one good thing can be equated to Jordan Peterson, because I think Jordan Peterson is way more unique in what his contributions are, both to religion and the culture and politics. I think it's way more unique. I think he's way more of an original thinker, and I think Jordan Peterson done a lot more to A, help people, and B, I think on balance, Jordan Peterson has been a net good for the libertarian cause. If you put it all on balance, even up until today, I think that Jordan Peterson has been a net good for the libertarian cause. Not that he's a libertarian or that every stance he has is perfectly libertarian, but I think he's done way more to promote things that are either explicitly or implicitly libertarian in people's belief systems and mindsets and whatnot, and in his books and stuff, than his shitty takes about Israel have done to the detriment of it. I can't think of many other things that Jordan Peterson's really bad on. There are things that he's not great on, but I think this recent thing on Zionism is the worst, obviously. The whole thing about, like, it's not as important as the Zionist point, but his thing about the Twitter thing, I actually think there's a case to be made there. And, like, his argument's coming mainly from when you make something free and there's no cost to using it, it's sort of like, and this to me is kind of tangential to libertarian thought, is like, it's kind of like the tragedy of the commons, right? It's like, when something's just free to use and everyone can use it equally, without any cost whatsoever, is that really a free market mechanism? And is that really like the best way to do free speech? Versus, $8 a month is not like unaffordable. And if it costs something to pay into it, the incentive structures change a little bit. I don't think they change for the negative. I do think there's an argument to be made they can change for the positive. Now, that's looking at that in a vacuum, not, we don't have time to get into Elon Musk and, all the problems there. Oh shit, I lost.
No, you're there. You just froze for like a second.
My internet like cut out and came back. So, but yeah, I don't think that, I think that you can make an argument that there is good reason, even like libertarian reasons, to make Twitter not free and to make the free version not work as well as the paid version. Like, I don't think, like, even if I could be convinced off of that, I don't think it's like, I'm not going to crucify Peterson for that take the way I'll go after. Like, I will go after him hard for his Zionism. I'm just like, I think that if Peterson was actually meaningfully challenged on it by the right people, I don't think he'd be ideologically possessed to hold on to it the same way someone like Ben Shapiro is going to be. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, I guess time will tell. Like, I guess where I am with him is because I used to be a fan of his too a few years ago. I'm at the point where whenever he says something dumb, I'm not surprised anymore. I'm just like, man. it's Jordan Peterson, where I see everyone else still shocked. Like, how could Jordan Peterson say something like this? And I'm like,
that's just because people fell into hero worship, which is definitely a danger. Like, you need to just be able to, with anybody, take the good and leave the bad and not make idols out of people. I think some people definitely did that with Jordan, and that's not good. You know, I mean, I think there are legitimate criticisms to make about him, and we should, you know, it's same thing with anyone, whether it's Jordan Peterson, whether it's Dave Smith, whether it's Ron Paul, even, you know, like we can criticize people. We can acknowledge, you know, the good, but also criticize the bad. But with all those people, I still think they're a net good. You know what I mean? So it's a difference between, you know, if people are like, I'm not trying to defend Jordan Peterson as a he's not a sacred cow. I just think that it's not fair to equate him to Sam Harris. I think he's done a lot more good than that.
All right, yeah. I mean, I was looking at it from I was looking at it from less of a libertarian perspective and just a personal perspective. But when you're talking about specifically like libertarianism, I think you're probably right. Like, he's probably pushed more people toward that frame of thought.
There's such an overlap between Jordan Peterson's lectures and talks about personal responsibility and natural hierarchies, and sort of like especially like in his first book, 12 Rules for Life, when he goes into like the biological foundation for competence hierarchies within nature, and how you can't even act in society in life without forming a hierarchy of sorts. And there's such a correlation and overlap between that and like praxeology and Austrian economics and stuff. And it's so I mean, it definitely, for people like me at least, like reading Jordan Peterson is sort of like what really purged a lot of the left leaning like garbage floating in my mind. It purged that crap out of there. And made me a lot more open to then reading Rothbard and Mises and all that. So I think,
yeah, it's funny because one of the people for me who kind of opened my mind to libertarianism was Bill Maher. Like, it's just because I was coming from like this hardcore, like Mike Huckabee style, like evangelical right wing bullshit. And I remember he was one of the first guys I started watching that made me kind of question my conservatism. And then I actually saw Ron Paul on his show. I think it was a replay because it was from like 2008. And I was like, wow, this guy really makes a lot of sense. And then I saw Rand Paul come on Bill Maher's show, because he almost endorsed Rand Paul for president in 2015. A lot of people forget about that, but that's a thing that almost happened. So it's kind of, it's very weird, like what people draw out of different commentators and like what leads them down different paths. So, I mean, not everyone's drawn to the same thing. So I guess that's an important thing to remember.
Yep.
But yeah, well, it's late. I think we've canceled ourselves enough for one night. We'll see if this one stays up. I think it ended up being pretty similar to the one we did last time. Some of the discussion we got into. So I don't know. I think this is something we should be allowed to talk about. And I think you should be allowed to talk about this at an even deeper level than we're allowed to on YouTube. Because I think talking about this type of stuff just draws, I don't know. It kind of distills a lot of the dumb bullshit that can fester in these areas when conversation isn't allowed to kind of bring more sunlight to these areas. So I think it's something we should do. But anyway, Jacob, give us your plugs.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Biblical Anarchy. As always, you can go to Daniel318.com or look up the Daniel 3 podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. And that's my OG podcast. I'll plug my new podcast, which I started just last month with the Libertarian Christian Institute, and that is the Biblical Anarchy podcast. So if you want to check that out, that's biblicalanarchypodcast.com. And again, the Biblical Anarchy podcast, you can search that on, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all that. And if you want to hear, more of that kind of content, that's where you can go for that. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for having me on, Reed. And hopefully we don't get canceled too hard after this one. I think this was a tamer version of the other conversation we had.
It was good. All right, guys. I will see you tomorrow night at 8:00 p.m. Eastern time. We got the Four Horsemen, and Pat McFarlane is our horseman guest. So there's definitely going to be lots of State Department propaganda being broken down and dismantled. So check that out. And Josh Smith coming on the show sometime this week. And then I think next Saturday, so a week from today, I got Adam Green coming on the show. We're going to talk about religion. That's going to be a really interesting episode. And I've got some emails out to some people trying to get more big guests on the show. I put a post out on YouTube the other day about how things have kind of died down here since May. Like a lot of the exponential growth kind of stopped, but I'm really trying to get some of those people on and get some interesting conversations going. So thanks for your continued support. Please like this video. If you're new here, please subscribe. Please share this video on platforms. I am on Twitter now, but I didn't get reinstated. I just got like 2,500 followers on a small account. So definitely don't have the reach I used to. If you guys would share these videos on Facebook, Twitter, whatever, that would be greatly appreciated. And we will catch you guys on the next episode.